Hey guys, today I'm going to be reading chapters 37 and 38 from Serafina and the Twisted Staff, and we are reading this with permission from the author and the publisher. Serafina tried digging down into the ground, past the pine needles into the dirt. She dug until her fingers bled, but it was no use. The mort safe went deep into the ground. If she dug down deep enough, she'd find nothing but rotted boards, bones, and body. The iron bars of the mort safe were close enough together to keep an adult human from getting through, but on many of the cages, including the one she was in, the bearded man had installed wire mesh to make sure smaller animals could not fit between the iron bars and escape. "I've tried to get through the wire," Wesa said as she examined the mesh on her cage. He started kicking the wire mesh with all his strength. It barely moved. But as Serafina saw the wire mesh flexing from the pressure of his kicks, she had an idea. She pressed herself close up against the lower side of her cage. The wire mesh consisted of squares just big enough to fit several fingers through. She grabbed one strand of the mesh tightly in her fingers and bent it. Then she bent it back. She bent it again, and then back again, over and over again. "What are you doing?" Wesa whispered. Serafina did not answer. She just kept bending that one strand of wire back and forth, back and forth. Her fingers were getting raw and her muscles ached, but finally she felt the wire heating up. She kept bending and bending as fast as she could. Then it snapped. She'd broke the strand. She couldn't help but smile when she saw the astonished look on Wesa's face. She had just broken metal with her bare hands. She was magic. She immediately started on the next wire, bending, bending, bending until it snapped in her fingers. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered to herself as she moved on to the next wire. Working on one strand at a time, she slowly peeled back an area of the wire mesh close to the ground where the space between the iron bars was largest. She tried to crawl through the hole, but it was very tight. She couldn't get through. "Get down, Serafina," Wesa whispered a warning. Serafina froze where she was, clinging to the dirt like a frightened animal as she heard the tick-ticking sound and the raspy scream of the owl. It flew right over their heads as it came into the camp. The man hurled the staff up into the sky. It blurred into a twig. The owl caught it in midair with its claws and then disappeared into the tree. Serafina didn't understand what was happening, but she was more determined than ever to get out. She pressed her face into the dirt and shoved her head into the hole. Buttressing her feet against the other side of the mort safe, she used the strength of her legs and torso to push her head through the hole, scraping her ears so close that they tore and bled. She shifted her neck, bent in her shoulder blade at her detached collarbone, and wriggled herself into the hole. Once she got some of her head, shoulder, and arm through the hole, she reached out for something to grab onto so she could pull her whole body through. But there was nothing to grab, nothing to pull on. She clawed at the earth, but she found no purchase. Now she was stuck. Wedged in the hole, she could move neither back nor forward. When she looked around for a branch or a rock or something to hold on to, she saw Braden in the cage next to her working furiously to bend the strands of the wire mesh like she had. "Hold on, Serafina," Braden whispered, but she knew it was no use. His body was larger than hers. Even if he got through the mesh, he couldn't fit between the bars. Nothing was working. Feeling the panic of entrapment, Serafina started gasping for air. Her heart pounded. She tried to keep her wits about her, but she breathed faster and faster. She looked towards the fire in the distance. How much time did they have before the bearded man came for them? Finally, Braden managed to break a small hole through the wire mesh of his cage. Just as she'd suspected, he couldn't fit his body through the narrow gap between the iron bars, but he put his hand through the hole and stretched his arm out toward her. At first, Serafina didn't understand what he was doing, but then she got it. She pressed herself up against the bars of her cage and stretched her arm out towards him. She pushed and pushed, her fingers outstretched. Reaching across the space between the cages, her hands finally clamped together in the middle. "Gotcha," he said as he grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. Now, with Braden pulling on her arm and her pushing with her legs, she found the leverage she needed. She managed to wriggle herself all the way through the hole, crawled out on the other side. She made it through. She had escaped. She quickly crawled over to Braden's cage and tried to open the latch from the outside. "He's coming," Wesa whispered frantically. Serafina heard the thrashing sound of the bearded man's footsteps heading in their direction. She finally got Braden's cage open and pulled him out. "Go free the dogs," she whispered to him. Then she hurried over to Wesa's cage and unlatched it. The bearded man would be here in a matter of seconds. As Wesa called free, Serafina glanced over. Gideon and Cedric were down on their haunches, excitedly looking at Braden as he opened their cages. Serafina used the last moment to quickly unlatch the wolf's cage. Her young wolf friend looked at her with gratefulness in his eyes. Then she raced away, knowing that the bearded man was just steps behind her. She and Braden and the others fled the cages, ducking low beneath the limbs of the pines as they ran. Behind her, she heard the snarling attack of the freed wolf as it leapt from its cage at the bearded man. She had no idea what would happen next, but at least the wolf had a fighting chance. Serafina, Braden, Wesa, and the two dogs fled into the cover of the pines. Wesa led the way, often scouting ahead for danger. Serafina didn't know how it was possible, but Gideon seemed to have regained some of his old strength and speed. Cedric was a heavy dog, unused to running long distances, but he was determined to keep up. Serafina ran at Braden's side, making sure he didn't fall behind. They finally escaped the blackened pines and entered the oaks, but they did not slow down. Their fear pushed them onward. They ran for miles. But partway back to Biltmore, Braden collapsed, too tired to continue. She let him rest for 10 seconds, but then pulled him back onto his feet. "Get up, Braden," she told him. "We've got to get home." They ran some more, but Braden finally crumpled in exhaustion. Too tired to run any farther, he did not give up or ask the others to slow down. He called Cedric over to him. "I need your help, my friend," he said as he climbed onto the St. Bernard's back and held on. "Come on, Cedric. Come on, boy. Let's go," Serafina called the dog, and together they ran. Coming from a long line of rescue dogs, Cedric seemed to understand exactly what they wanted. He charged forward with new speed and purpose, carrying the young master along with him. Chapter 38. They ran through the hickory and the hemlock, through the alder and the elm. They crossed thickets and meadows, streams and ravines, pushed by a fear darker than they had ever known. As the faint light of Biltmore House finally came into view near dawn, Serafina sensed that they had escaped the horror behind them. She slowed and looked over at Wesa. They breathed heavily as they walked beside each other. "I have to go back to Biltmore," she said. Wesa nodded. "I'll go find your mother and the cubs and make sure they're safe." Then he stopped her with his hand and looked at her with a new ferocity in his eyes. "You were right. We can't run from this fight. I will rejoin you later. Stay bold, Serafina." "Stay bold, Wesa," she said in return as they quickly embraced, and then Wesa dove into the underbrush and disappeared. Braden watched her say goodbye to Wesa and then said, "I see you found the boy from the forest." "He joined with my mother and the cubs. His name is Wesa." "He reminds me of you," Braden said, his voice weak and tired, but filled with a kindness that she did not expect. "Me too," she agreed. "Do you want to go with him?" Braden asked uncertainly. He looked toward the house in the distance. "The dogs and I can make it to Biltmore on our own from here." "No," she said. "I want to go home with you." Braden nodded, and they continued on together toward Biltmore with Gideon and Cedric at their sides. "Look," Serafina said, when she saw a rider galloping at high speed across the large lawn in front of the house. The rider was up on her stirrups, leaning forward in the saddle, galloping at incredible speed, her long red hair flowing behind her. It was Lady Rowena. Rowena rode into the stable courtyard. When Serafina and Braden and the two dogs walked into the courtyard a few moments later, a force of 30 men were gathering, some on foot, some with horses. "Mount up, men," Mr. Vanderbilt shouted from atop his horse. "We're going back out." Serafina and Braden looked around at the ragged group. Many of the men from the original hunting party were wounded and exhausted. They had been fighting the coyotes in the forest all night. The horses had suffered the worst, and the trackers had lost all but one of the plot hounds. The badly shaken huntmaster, who had dismounted from his sweating, terrified horse and now sat collapsed on the ground, appeared too shocked by what they'd been through to even rouse himself. But most of the men were mounting fresh horses, and new men were joining the effort. Rowena was right there with Mr. Vanderbilt on a new horse and ready to ride. Her hair was hanging down, her face was scratched, and she looked exhausted, but she seemed determined to help in the search. "Come on, hurry!" Rowena was calling to the others as she wheeled her horse around. "We have to go and look for them." Serafina's pa, several of the stablemen, and a dozen other servants were also joining the group. But when Mr. Vanderbilt pulled his horse around, he saw Braden and Serafina and the dogs coming toward him. "Thank God," Mr. Vanderbilt said. He dismounted, dropped his reins, and took the exhausted Braden into his arms. "Serafina," her pa said, relieved, as he came toward her and pulled her into his chest. I'm all right, Pa, she said. I'm not hurt. As she hugged her pa, Serafina saw Rowena dismount and embrace Braden, obviously relieved that he was still alive. The other men were patting the young master's back and welcoming him home. Mr. Vanderbilt knelt down and scuffed Cedric's neck. "It's good to see you, boy," he said as he petted his dog. Then Mr. Vanderbilt's dark eyes rose up and looked at Serafina. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice shaking, fearful that he'd be angry at her for leading them into such a catastrophe. As she and her pa turned toward Mr. Vanderbilt, she said, "I had no idea that was going to happen." "None of us have ever seen anything like that," he said. He wasn't angry with her. His voice was filled with a sense of common purpose. They were a pack. They were in this together. "Could the coyotes have been infected with rabies?" her pa asked. "I hope to God not," the veterinarian said, overhearing their conversation as he tended to the slashed leg of a nearby horse. "If it's rabies, then all the men, horses, and dogs who were bitten last night will be dead within days, and there's nothing we can do about it." "It didn't look like rabies to me," Mr. Vanderbilt said, shaking his head. "There had to be 50 coyotes, and they had a deliberateness in their eyes." The huntmaster shook his head. "Those animals were possessed," he mumbled, his eyes glazed with disbelief. "We need to go back, Uncle," Braden said. "Go back?" Mr. Vanderbilt said in surprise. "There are still animals up there that need our help." Mr. Vanderbilt shook his head. "I'm sorry, Braden, we're not going back out right now. We can't risk it. Everyone is exhausted. We need to rest and regroup." "It was awful, Uncle," Braden said, and then proceeded to describe the bearded man and the animals in the cages. "Serafina got me and the dogs out of there, and then we ran." When Mr. Vanderbilt looked at Serafina, she could see the gratitude in his expression, but she knew the fight wasn't over. "We need to find Mr. Grayson, sir," she said. "He's involved in this." "I was suspicious of him from the start," Mr. Vanderbilt said. "He represented himself as an officer of the law, so I didn't think I should interfere with his investigation, but I hired a private detective to check into his credentials." "What did you find out?" Braden asked. "Mr. Grayson has no association with any city or state agency. He's a fraud." "What are you going to do, Uncle?" Braden asked. "I've sent word for the Asheville police to come at once. They'll arrest him." "But where is Grayson now?" Serafina asked. "We've searched for him. He's not in the house," Mr. Vanderbilt said, "but he may still be on the grounds." "I think Grayson is far more dangerous than he seems, sir," Serafina said, "and I fear that the police will be coming on horseback or carriage and will run into the same type of problem we did." Mr. Vanderbilt nodded. "We'll arm several groups of men and start looking for Grayson on the grounds. If and when the police arrive, we'll go back up to that area, free those animals, and destroy the cages. Until then, I want all of you to stay in the house and stay safe." As the men continued talking, Serafina, Braden, and Rowena huddled beneath the arch of the porte-cochere, the carriage entrance that led into the house. "What happened?" Rowena asked, her voice quivering. "We're all right," Braden said. "We got the dogs. That's the important thing." "I was so worried about you," she said, looking at both Braden and Serafina. Serafina realized that danger and death seemed to erase the lines of class. Suddenly, everyone was the same, fighting to hold on to their lives and the people around them. She saw it in Mr. Vanderbilt, her pa, the huntmaster, the trackers, and the men on their horses willing to go out into some fearsome danger to rescue her and Braden. And now she saw it in Lady Rowena. "Thank you for helping us, Rowena," Braden said. "When my father sent me here to Biltmore, he told me to make friends," Lady Rowena said, looking at the two of them and smiling wanly. "I think maybe I have." "You definitely have," Braden said. "Will your father be coming to Biltmore soon?" Braden asked. "I believe he'll be here rather sooner than we all expect," Rowena said. "He's coming for Christmas." Serafina thought she sensed something strange in Rowena when she said this. Was it sadness? Worry? She couldn't quite place it. "Are you eager to see him?" Serafina asked. "The truth is," Rowena said, "my father thinks I am a rather silly little girl." "I'm not sure that's true," Braden said. Rowena shook her head. "No, it's true. I'm afraid my father has never thought too much of me, but pretty soon, one way or another, he's going to have to start." "He'd be very proud of you if he knew how brave you were last night," Serafina said, trying to encourage her. But as they were talking, Rowena looked like she was going to kill over right where she stood. Exhaustion had finally begun to catch up with the poor girl. Braden reached out to steady her. If you will excuse me, Lady Rowena said, finally touching Braden's arm and closing her eyes for a moment like she was going to faint. I'm feeling rather tired. I'm going to my room to take a bath and change into some clean clothes. Braden nodded. Get some rest and we'll do the same. My uncle and the men will take care of things now. As two of the maids helped the bedraggled, mud-splattered Lady Rowena limp slowly back to the house, Serafina heard her mutter in bewildered shock. Oh dear, I think I may have gotten dirt on my dress. She was so exhausted, she was nearly delirious. Serafina stayed with Braden. As she looked over at Mr. Vanderbilt talking to her pa and the other men, she knew they were making sensible decisions, but she couldn't get over the feeling that it wasn't enough, that everyone, including her, was missing something. It was as if they were putting together a puzzle, and they thought they were almost done, but there was this whole other box of pieces that they didn't even know about. She watched as the stablemen washed the blood from the courtyard bricks, and the maids cleaned the mud from the steps that led into the house. Come on, Serafina said to Braden as they began to walk along the front of the house. We need to figure this out. Whoever that man was last night, he seemed insane, Braden said. Like he was consumed by some sort of feud or blood vengeance. He said he was going to burn the place down, Braden said. Serafina remembered the chilling words. What do you think he was talking about? Braden asked. I'm not sure, she said. Do you think he was talking about Biltmore? Braden asked. As they reached the front entrance of the house, Serafina glanced up at the carved stone archway above the front door. It depicted a strange-looking bearded man brandishing a long spear or staff of some kind. I don't know. It's definitely possible. Does the Vanderbilt family have enemies? She asked. What about your uncle? Does anyone hate him or want to do him harm? No, I don't think so, Braden said. He's a good man. I know he is, Serafina said. But is there something from his past that we don't know? What do we know about his life back in New York before he came here? Or all his trips to Europe and all over the world? Could it be that he came to the remote mountains of North Carolina for a reason? You think he was trying to escape something? Or maybe someone? I don't know, she said. Come on, Braden said, leading her into the house. I have an idea. The two of them were tired, dirty, and hungry, but they were too intent on solving the mystery to stop now. Serafina followed Braden down the gallery and into the library. What are we looking for? Serafina asked as they entered, not sure how Mr. Vanderbilt's collection of books could help them. My uncle keeps his travel records here, Braden said as he went over to one of the cabinets. Maybe we'll find something. Serafina went to Braden's side and tried to help him look, but she wasn't sure what they were looking for. She found a set of black leather-bound journals entitled Books I Have Read, GWV. As she flipped through the pages, she saw that Mr. Vanderbilt had been recording the title and author of every book he'd read since 1875, when he was 12 years old. There were thousands of entries over the years, in English, French, and other languages. Braden found evidence of his uncle's many trips throughout the United States and abroad, to England, France, Italy, China, Japan, and many other countries. And she knew that the house was full of art, sculpture, and artifacts from his travels. In fact, she'd just shattered one of them. Any one of those artifacts could have been haunted or cursed in some way, which might explain a blood vengeance against Mr. Vanderbilt. But the more she thought about it, the more one particular thought came to her mind. The man she'd seen on the road that first night hadn't struck her as a New Yorker or any other kind of northerner or foreigner. His skin was craggy with the weathered cracks of these mountain winds. His mustache and his beard were long and gray, like many of the local elders, and his voice was tinged with the sound of the mountain folk. She could not be sure from their brief and terrifying encounters, but he seemed like he was an Appalachian man. She remembered the disturbing words he'd screamed to the owl. We shall burn that place down. Let's look into the records of Biltmore House, she said. Not my uncle's travels? No, let's focus on Biltmore, she said, more confident now. Those are over here, he said, leading her to a different set of boxes. As they dug through the papers, it was hard to imagine finding any answers there. But when Braden opened a box of scratchy old photographs, she leaned in closer. The first photograph she examined showed a vast stretch of clear-cut land with nothing but stumps and weeds, a team of 20 or 30 mules, a couple of wagons piled with firewood, and a score of scroungers with axes. It was hard to imagine, but judging by the view of the mountains in the background, it appeared to be the hilltop on which Biltmore was constructed. The clearing was so open and bare and treeless. There were no gardens, no woods, just scarred and empty land. This was how it had looked when Mr. Vanderbilt bought the land years ago. The next photograph showed hundreds of stonemasons, bricklayers, carpenters, and other craftsmen building the lower floors of Biltmore House. There were men and women, white folk and black folk, Americans and foreigners, northerners and southerners, and many mountain folk. Her heart warmed when she spotted her pa in one of the photographs, working on a geared crane system among many other men. She smiled, for in her mind she'd always imagined her pa working alone, building Biltmore almost by himself, for that was how she'd always seen him working. She realized how foolish she had been. He had been but one of thousands of men who had worked for 6 years. It was amazing to see the scaffolded walls of Biltmore rising from nothingness in photograph after photograph. A while later, she searched through the documents of Biltmore, trying to find the clues they needed. Serafina looked over at Braden. Exhausted, he had fallen asleep in one of the cushioned chairs. Serafina let him sleep, but she kept looking. "I'm starving," Braden announced when he awoke. They quickly retrieved some food from the kitchen, but as soon as they'd eaten and washed up, they went back to work. Later that afternoon, as Braden was digging through yet another box, he handed her a photograph. "Look at this one." Something about it caught Serafina's eye. Like the other photographs, this one was filled with men and wooden scaffolding and the half-built Biltmore rising in the background. She wasn't even sure what the photographer had been trying to make a picture of, other than the construction site itself. Some of the men in the picture were working, some talking, some looking at the camera, others not. When she studied the photograph more closely, one of the men drew her attention. The image was so small it was difficult to tell, but he had a heavily wrinkled face, a long gray mustache and beard. He was not wearing a long coat or carrying a walking stick, but he was gazing into the camera and his eyes looked like dots of silver. It was their enemy, the man she'd seen in the forest. This was him. She was sure of it. That meant he wasn't a forest haint or nightmarish specter, but a real person. At least, he had been years before. "Braden, look at this," Serafina said, showing him the photograph. "We need to know who this man is." "Then we need to talk to Mr. Olmsted," Braden said.